Good evening. My name's David Malone, and I'm fortunate to work at the United Nations University in Tokyo. We have quite a public outreach program here, and we stage public conversations every now and then. And for those of you who aren't able to join us, we like to put a prequel up online so that you'll have an idea of the sorts of things we talk about at the university. And this evening, we have a terrific guest who normally lives in New York, although he travels extensively, James Traub. He's a very well-known writer of books as well as magazine pieces, and currently he writes for foreignpolicy.com, a very entrepreneurial website that is action central for foreign policy coverage. Jim worked for the New Yorker for a number of years, also for even more years for the New York Times Magazine, but he defected to foreignpolicy.com 4 years ago, I think, or something like it, and we're delighted because he can write at the length he wishes now. And he recently wrote a very long piece about Obama and Obama's foreign policy, and that's what we'll be discussing in Tokyo, and very briefly now with you. So welcome, Jim.
Well, thank you, David. Happy
Great
to be here.
to have you here. What made you write this piece about Obama now?
Well, first of all, I have been following and writing about him since the beginning. And in fact, when he first ran for president, I spent time with him. I wrote a profile of him for the New York Times Magazine, and the premise of the profile was, does Barack Obama have a worldview? Most candidates for president in the United States have nothing like that because most Americans who run for office haven't done very much foreign policy. There are important exceptions like the first President Bush and Richard Nixon, but not many. Obama had no prior foreign experience, but he actually did have something like a worldview. And so I spent time talking to him, but also listening to his speeches. And his speeches were then, as they remained later, extremely articulate and well thought out. And so you could deduce what his worldview was from the speeches as well as, of course, from my conversation with him.
Now, he had a shock, an agreeable shock, but perhaps an unwelcome one ultimately, very early in his tenure in receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And he gave an acceptance speech, which was gracious, but tell us a bit more about your interpretation of it.
Well, that speech, which is a real favorite, though I think oddly a favorite of people who don't like Barack Obama as well. I've heard conservatives say, now that was a good speech. Now, the interesting thing about the speech is that he was at least modest enough to realize that he didn't deserve it. And so he did approach it with a certain spirit of humility. But the really interesting thing about it is that it made him think about this question of peace. Well, everybody is in favor of peace. And the people who have received it in the past, like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who were great heroes of his, especially King, are apostles of peace. But he used the speech to reflect on what it means to be the president of the United States and to think about the question of peace. Because he said there are times when a president is irresponsible to not resort to force, to war. And he said, the revered Martin Luther King would never say this, but I have to say this because I'm the president of the United States, and I am not anti-war. It was an important thing, I think, for him to say because since he had opposed the war in Iraq, he was seen by many people, and to no small extent voted for president as the anti-war candidate. And of course, since the war in Vietnam, there has been a big anti-war tradition on the American left.
Yes.
Obama's not part of that. Obama's younger than that. He didn't grow up during that period, and he wasn't shaped by it. And so when, in fact, he had opposed the war in Iraq, he had given a famous speech then, back in 2002, saying, I'm not against all wars, I'm against dumb wars. And he said, presciently, it turned out, the war in Iraq was a dumb war. Back to the Nobel Peace Prize speech. He said there are times when it will be inevitable for an American president to order young men and women into war. But then he went on to say, there is nothing glorious in it. There is nothing romantic in it. It's a tragedy. All war is failure. And so he tried very hard, in a way that I think is very characteristic of him, to encompass both ends of an intrinsically ambivalent situation or ambiguous situation, which is there must be the willingness to use force. There must not be the glorification of force. Force is a failure, but force is necessary.
Now, the speech for which the president is most famous, it seems to me, certainly the one that made the strongest impression on me, partly because I'd lived in the Middle East for some of my life, was his speech in Cairo. I think it was in 2009, could it have been?
June of 2009.
Which was a speech really full of hope, optimism, a very energizing speech. And not too long afterwards, there was the Arab Spring. So can you tell us a bit about the speech and whether you think it has anything to do with the Arab Spring subsequently?
Oh, well, I'll answer the
out?
second part first. It has nothing to do with the Arab Spring. Any more than George Bush's war in Iraq has to do with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was, as far as I'm concerned, a completely internally generated event. But to go back to the speech in Cairo, so I teach students in Abu Dhabi, and we had a class on the Arab Spring several weeks ago. These students are only 20 now, so they only were 14 or 15 at the time. And I said, do you remember that? They all remembered it. They all remembered it.
And they would have been quite young then.
They were 14 or 15 at the time. And what they remember is the excitement of the moment, the fact that Obama came to Cairo, the fact that Obama said, Assalamu alaikum. He didn't just say the Quran, he said the Holy Quran. He quoted from it was very, very deferential. And the deference was not just a little grace note. In fact, what I find so interesting about the speech is that while he wanted to go to the Middle East and say, look, these are the great issues that both divide us and unite us, before he got to any of those issues, meaning Middle East peace, terrorism, and so on, he spent a long time, in effect, introducing him to them and saying, I'm someone whose father was Kenyan. I'm someone who has many relatives who come from the Islamic world. It is not unfamiliar to me. It is part of me. And he said the Islamic world is part of the United States. And he gave the usual litany of great Islamic things and people and so forth in the United States. But it felt different because he was saying, I am a different person. And he said that because he believed, and this maybe was terribly naive on his part, but he was deeply encouraged to believe that he had himself the capacity to put America's tormented relations with Middle Eastern countries on a different kind of footing because he was a different kind of person. He was a different kind of person, above all, from his predecessor, George W. Bush. He spoke a different language. He came from a different place. He was of a different generation. He had a different voice, a different face. He was a black man. And so in all those ways, he believed very strongly that he could forge a special kind of personal relationship with other people, that he could reach across the barrier of states and national interests to speak to universal interests, to speak to interests that people would acknowledge they had despite whatever bitterness there was between the states. And so if you listen to not only those early portions of his speech where he speaks that way, but to later portions of his speech where he's talking about specific concerns like Israel-Palestine. The passage on Israel-Palestine is all about a kind of mutual acknowledgement. He said, Palestinians must acknowledge that violence is not a way to succeed. And he said, how do I know that? I know that because black Americans discovered that we could not succeed in gaining rights through violence. We only succeeded in the end by accepting the fundamental principles of the United States and showing that we merited equal treatment. At the same time, he said Israel must accept the full validity of the Palestinians' aspiration to a state. He believed that that would be a way of breaking that stalemate. That would be a way of breaking that stalemate, and that he would then demonstrate to both sides that he was deeply committed, personally committed, to gaining a Middle East peace. Well, that was very moving, and I think very exciting in the Middle East, less so for the Israelis. They didn't like being put on an equal footing with the Palestinians at all, but it didn't change anything. I mean, here, this is the kind of pathos of the thing, that I think Obama had been given such an incredible reception in the world. The only thing you can compare it to really is Woodrow Wilson coming to Europe in 1919 at the end of World War I. And Wilson similarly believed that he had almost a mission to speak to people across heads of state. And he too moved people enormously. And he too failed completely to change the underlying situation that he hoped to change. And Obama, I think, encountered the same thing. He moved people. He was a tremendously romantic, admired, charismatic figure. But the underlying reasons for the stalemate in Israel-Palestine and the underlying reasons for the United States' lack of popularity in the Middle East, those were objective facts. They weren't a matter of misperception. And so much of that beautiful mood dissipated over time.
Indeed. Now, to conclude, Obama was the president who very much wanted to end the American occupation of Iraq. He did end the American occupation of Iraq, but eventually he sent some of the American armed forces back to Iraq in a limited role, but still symbolically important, to back up efforts by the Iraqi government to ward off the Islamic State. So where are we today? How would you assess Obama and his foreign policy today?
Obama went into office believing that he could be a transformative figure. He talked a lot, not about old-fashioned state-to-state issues, but about the new global issues like the environment, energy, helping weak states, non-proliferation. He thought that would be the new agenda. And I think what's happened is the world has sucked him back in, that you cannot, well, in general, you cannot wish away state-to-state tension. But also, these recent years have been terrible moments. He could have been a far less naive, more worldly, more pragmatic, more realist figure, and he would similarly have been buffeted and bruised by this reality. So you mentioned Iraq, it's a very good example. He persuaded himself, and I shouldn't say just he, Joe Biden, all the people around him believed, first of all, they desperately wanted to get out of Iraq, and maybe therefore they persuaded themselves that they could, that the Iraqis could stand on their own 2 feet. And there is no question that they did not anticipate, and by the way, neither did most people, neither did many people, that Iraq would suddenly collapse before this unprecedented form of terrorist organization, but that it would collapse so easily after billions of dollars of American aid. That did show the hollowness of what had appeared to be the nation-building effort by the United States.
Indeed. Well, I hope this short clip will give you a sense of how exciting it can be at UNU when we have a guest as interesting as Jim is. We're all looking forward very much to hearing from him this evening. If you go through clips of our public conversation series, you'll see that they range very broadly over international relations. Certain factors keep cropping up, history, geography, facts on the ground that defeat even very ambitious projects like that of President Obama at the outset, which were widely supported as well by many of his country people, and particularly outside the United States. There was a huge swell of support for Obama's vision of American foreign policy in the world. Thank you for joining us, Jim. Above all, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you.